This is a podcast for anyone who has ever looked at the life they built, the house, the children, the calendar, the school bags by the door, the messages waiting to be answered, the dinner half made on the bench, and wondered quietly, how did we get here? I'm Gabriella Pomare, family lawyer, author, mother and co-parent, and in this space we talk about the conversations people usually have too late. The silence before separation, the invisible load, the resentment under I'm fine, the loneliness inside a shared life, the reality of co-parenting, and the possibility of rebuilding with more honesty, dignity, and care. This podcast is not about perfect families, it is about conscious ones. For the before, for the break, for the becoming. Let's begin. If you have ever lay awake next to someone and felt completely alone, this episode's for you. If you have ever carried the whole family in your head and then been asked, hey, just tell me what to do, this episode's for you. And if you've ever looked around at the life you built, the kitchen, the house, the children, the calendar, the school bags by the door, the half-drunk coffee on the kitchen bench, the washing folded but not yet put away, the dinner you made even though you were exhausted and no one ate, and thought quietly and almost guiltily, how did we get here? This episode's for you. Before we begin, I want to say that this podcast is for general information and education only. It is not legal advice. Every family, every relationship, every separation, and every person's circumstances are different. And if you do need advice about your situation, you should speak with an appropriately qualified professional. So, this is episode 1, and thank you for being here. I wanted to name the first proper episode of this podcast to really have the same words that became the name of the podcast, because I think we spend so much time talking about the end, the day someone leaves, the day someone says, I can't do this anymore, the day someone finds the message, reads the email, or sees the transaction, or maybe hears the words that they then can't unhear. You know, the day someone packs a bag, or the day someone sleeps in the spare room, the day one person calls a lawyer and suddenly a relationship that once began with love and promise and desire and photographs, family plans, imagined futures, becomes something that's now filled with file notes, proposed arrangements, emails, letters, calendars, bank statements, and just dates in a diary. Very few people really talk about the before. I'm not talking about the obvious before, not the wedding photo, not the honeymoon before, not the first baby before, and not the curated life we have in albums and camera rolls and old anniversary posts, but the quieter before, the private before, the before the relationship is still technically intact, but emotionally changing shape under the surface. The before where nothing dramatic has happened that day, and yet something feels different. The before when you're standing in the kitchen at 8:07 p.m. The children are finally asleep or pretending to be asleep. The bench is covered in crumbs and someone's left a school note under a magnet on the fridge. Your phone's flashing with messages you haven't answered. And you're listening to the low hum of the dishwasher while someone else moves somewhere else in your house, as if you're both workers on the same night shift, rather than two people who would once not wait to be alone together. The before, where you're still functioning. And that really is the strange part, because you are functioning. You're still remembering to answer emails and make appointments, buy birthday presents. You remember which kid needs the white socks for sports day, and which kid refuses yogurt in their lunchbox if it's touched the sandwich. You're paying bills, you're sending polite replies, you're smiling at school pickup. You're going to work and you're asking other people how they are. You're remembering the sunscreen, the groceries, the family birthdays. You know when your car needs servicing. You remember the thing everyone else would have forgotten if you had not held it somewhere in your already crowded mind. And because you are functioning, people assume you're fine. Sometimes even you assume you're fine because there is something deeply convincing about a life that just continues to run. The house still stands and the calendar's full, and you see the children laughing. The washing's still in the drawers and the bills are mostly paid, and your family still looks like a family from a distance. And yet, inside you, somewhere really quiet and hard to reach, something has begun to whisper that this is not how love is supposed to feel. And I'm not saying that because love should always be cinematic and because relationships should always feel easy or because life and work and children and mortgages and aging parents and deadlines and stress and laundry is meant to feel like the beginning of a romance. But because somewhere along the way, your relationship stopped feeling like a place that you could finally exhale. And it started feeling like a place that you had to manage. And there's such a difference between being tired with someone and I think being tired because of someone. You get me? There's such a difference between the exhaustion of a shared life and the exhaustion of a life that's shared in name only, where one person holds the invisible map and the other person keeps asking where to go. And there's such a difference between a difficult season and a quiet erosion. And this is the part people often can't explain when someone asks, but what happened? Because, yeah, what happened? How do you explain that nothing happened, but at the same time, everything happened? How do you explain that it wasn't one night or one fight, one sentence, one betrayal, one slammed door or one missed school event? Maybe one forgotten anniversary or one cold look across a dinner table. It wasn't just one argument in the car or one Christmas where you cried quietly in the bathroom whilst everyone else opened presents. But it was all of it, gathered slowly like dust in the corners of a room that no one wants to clean. How do you explain to someone that it was the thousandth time you asked for something very small and you were made to feel like you were asking for too much? How do you explain that you stopped telling them what hurt because their response became another thing that you just had to recover from? And how do you explain that, yeah, you didn't wake up one morning and just stop loving them? That over time your love became covered in admin and disappointment, sometimes resentment, maybe politeness, practicality, your kids' routines, your grocery list, your bank transfers, and in the unanswered bids for affection and quiet. Really, it was that humiliation of needing to ask for the same kind of care again and again. How do you explain to your friends that you weren't trying to leave at first? You were just trying to be seen. And that's why I wanted to start this episode right here. Because by the time many people reach a family lawyer's office, and I've sat across from so many people in that moment, the relationship didn't break that week. It often didn't even break that month. Sometimes it didn't even break that year. Because by the time someone sits in that chair and begins to tell me their story, the public version may be new, but that private grief that I see and I feel and yeah, I relate to, it's often old. They'll say to me something like, oh, I think my marriage is over. But then they tell me about things that began years ago. They tell me about the babies, the sleep deprivation, the return to work, and the first time they started feeling invisible. They tell me about, the promotion that made life more comfortable, but then made one person disappear into always working. Or they tell me about their family business that became yet another child in their family. Or they tell me about the resentment that started as a small ache and became a room they were living inside. They tell me about the family holiday where they packed everyone's bags, booked the accommodation, organized the passports, remembered the medication, bought the snacks, planned the activities, managed the moods. And then they jumped on the plane and they were told they seemed tense. They tell me about the nights that they lay awake beside someone who was asleep within minutes while their own mind kept running through school forms, mortgage payments, and I don't know whether one kid's cough sounded worse. They would lay wondering whether their marriage was just tired or whether something had gone missing that could not come back. And they tell me about asking for help and being told, you should have just said something. when the thing they wanted wasn't really help. It was partnership. And look, that distinction, that's what matters so much. Because help is what you ask from someone who's visiting your life. Partnership's what you expect from someone who built the life with you. Help says, tell me what to do and I'll assist you. But partnership says, I see what needs to be done because this is mine too. Help says, why didn't you ask? Partnership says, I noticed. Help says, I would have done it if you just told me. While partnership says, you shouldn't have to carry the remembering all alone. And I think so many relationships begin to break, not because there's no love, but because the person who is carrying too much starts to feel like they've become a manager of a life that was supposed to be shared. And then when they finally say, hey, I need more, the other person starts hearing criticism rather than the desperation. And that's the tragedy, guys. When one person says, I'm drowning, and the other person hears, oh, you're not good enough. And when one person says, I feel alone, and the other person hears, you're blaming me. And when one person says, hey, I need you to notice, but the other person hears, just tell me what to do. And suddenly the conversation is no longer about loneliness. It becomes about defensiveness, about who's right, about tone and timing, whether you ask nicely enough, whether you appreciate what the other person does do, about whether you're overreacting, about whether really this is such a big deal. And somewhere in that argument, the original ache gets lost. The ache that simply said, hey, I miss you. Or the ache that said, I miss feeling like we're in this together. The ache that said, I'm tired of being strong in a house where no one notices the cost of my strength. And that is where the break often begins. Not in a courtroom or a legal letter, and not when finally someone says the word separation. It begins in the moment where one person stops expecting the other person to understand. When asking starts to feel pointless, and when disappointment becomes predictable and the body stops reaching, when you stop sending the text you once would have sent, when something funny happens and they're no longer the first person that you want to tell, when you make a decision and you realize you didn't even think to discuss it, when you start feeling relieved that they're working it late or they're going away, and when the silence at home feels easier than another conversation that's going to end in you probably apologizing for the way you expressed yourself. And when you start saying, I'm fine, and you know that you are lying, but the lie feels so much easier than the truth. I think the words, I'm fine, are one of the saddest sentences in a relationship when it starts to be said too many times. Yeah, because the first time, maybe it means I don't have the energy to talk about it right now. But the second time, it probably means I want you to notice that I'm not fine without me having to explain it. But by the 10th time, the 50th time, the 100th time, probably means I've learned that telling you the truth about how I'm feeling doesn't ultimately lead to care. And after a while, I'm fine just becomes less of a sentence and more of a locked door. And a person can be standing right there, making coffee, folding clothes, feeding kids, laughing at the right moment, putting lipstick on in the car mirror, carrying a birthday cake into a party. And inside them, the door is closing quietly and politely and without a scene. And you know what? That is why some separations shock one person, but make perfect sense to the other. You hear it all the time. One person says, I had no idea, while the other thinks, I've been telling you this in every way I knew how. And one person might say, this came out of nowhere, whilst the other one says, I've been leaving slowly for years. One partner often says, why didn't you say something? And the other one thinks I did, but you only heard me when I finally stopped trying. And I don't say that to make one person the villain because I think that's too easy and real relationships are rarely that simple. I think there are many relationships where two people aren't monsters, but they're tired, they're patterned, they're defended, they're carrying histories that they probably don't even fully understand. They're reacting to old wounds in the present, and they're repeating what they saw growing up. They're performing gender roles they never consciously chose, or trying to survive work and parenting and bills. And these days, aging parents, body changes, pregnancy loss, infertility, ambition, disappointment, social media, school WhatsApp groups, family expectations, and the quiet pressure to look like they're doing it well. The reality is both people are lonely, but one has become louder and one has become quieter. And they're both afraid, but one controls and one withdraws. They both want connection, I'm sure of it. But by the time they reach for it, they are armored. And the armor is what touches first. Now, this is the part of this podcast I want to hold because I think we're missing a place where people can speak honestly about the emotional reality of family life, before it becomes a legal problem or a public announcement or just a neatly worded statement about separating amicably, before it becomes evident, before it becomes everyone else's opinion. There is a whole private world, a before. There are mornings when you are buttering toast and fighting back tears because the child's asking you again where their library bag is, and someone else is asking whether there's clean laundry, and you hear your phone ringing. The kettle has boiled and gone cold twice, and the person that you once loved is probably standing 2 meters away. And there are evenings when you sit in the car in your driveway for an extra 3 minutes because inside the house there's no obvious crisis, there's no emergency, there's no single event everyone would understand as a reason to cry. But there's also no tenderness. And the absence of tenderness, that becomes its own kind of weather. And I feel you. I've been there. I've done that. I've sat in the driveway in the car. And there are nights when you scroll beside each other. And not because either of you really cares about what's on your screens, but because the screens become something small, like a glowing wall that wants nothing of you. And then there are the conversations that almost happen, the kind of rise you feel in your throat while you're brushing your teeth or you're turning off the lamp or you're standing in the doorway of your bedroom and you're thinking, yep, tonight I'll say it. Tonight I'll tell them I'm lonely. Tonight I will say I need you. Tonight I'll say I'm scared that we're becoming something that I don't recognize. Tonight I will say I don't want to live like colleagues raising children under the same roof. Tonight I'll tell them I miss us. But then someone's tired or distracted or defensive or dismissive, or there's a work call or a child wakes up and the timing feels wrong. And you remember the last time you tried, you just swallowed the words back down. But can I tell you this? Swallowed words, they don't disappear. They become tension. They become resentment. And they become distance. They become little sharpness in your voice when you answer a normal question, like the way you load the dishwasher harder than necessary, or the way you no longer soften when the person walks into the room, and the way you perform being okay until you just can't remember what it felt like to be honest. And I think a lot of people imagine resentment as anger. But can I tell you, resentment's grief that hasn't yet found a safe place to go. It's grief with nowhere to land, and it's a grief that hasn't been made to feel unreasonable. It's grief of being reliable and overlooked, and it's the grief of becoming so capable that no one thinks to ask whether capability is actually costing you something. And sometimes when a person finally speaks from that place, it comes out badly. Not because the need is invalid, but because the need has been living underground for too long. Yeah, it comes out as sharp and critical and sarcastic or cold, unfair, exhausted. And it's loaded with all the earlier versions of conversations that never went anywhere. And so instead of you saying, I feel lonely, it comes out as, you never do anything, or must be nice, or of course you forgot. Well, don't worry, I'll do it like I do everything else. But the person's no longer speaking only from that particular moment that they're in. You get me? I know you feel me. You're speaking from the whole archive of previous experiences. And the other person reacts to the delivery rather than the wound. They'll say in response, "Don't speak to me like that," or "Nothing I do is ever enough," or "Why are you making this into another fight?" And perhaps in that moment, yeah, they're not entirely wrong because maybe the delivery was sharp. Maybe the words weren't fair. Maybe the tone did hurt. But underneath that tone, there may be something worth listening to because people don't usually become resentful because of one dishwasher or one school lunch or one late arrival. They become resentful because the small thing has become symbolic. The dishwasher is not the dishwasher. The forgotten appointment is not just the appointment. The birthday present they forgot is not just the present. It has become evidence in that person's mind of such a bigger story. The story that says, "I'm in this life alone." The story that says, "You don't see what I do." The story that says, "If I don't remember, it's just not going to happen." And the story that says, "My needs come after everyone else's." And that is the dangerous point. Because when the person who has been the infrastructure of a family starts to fail, everyone suddenly asks why. Why are you so tired? Why are you so emotional? Why are you not fun anymore? Why do you never want to be touched? Why are you always on edge? Why are you making everything difficult? Why aren't you happy? And the answer may be because I have been disappearing in front of you, not dramatically, not all at once, and not in a way that, made a sound, but slowly. In the mornings, in the evenings, in bed, in the kitchen, in the car, in the messages I haven't sent, in the birthdays you haven't remembered, in the holidays I pack for alone, in the decisions you stopped helping me make, and in the emotional weather I've carried alone for years. And this is where it becomes so hard to explain, right? Because from the outside, there may be no obvious crisis. There's been no huge dramatic betrayal. There hasn't been that photograph you found on their phone. There's not been that screaming match, your neighbor's heard through the wall, or no final unforgivable sentence that everyone can point to and say, yeah, that's where it ended. And yet, inside the relationship, there's this slow sense that something is becoming less reachable, that the person who once felt like your safest place has become another person whose moods you study, whose needs you anticipate, and whose disappointment you absorb, and whose presence you no longer soften with when they come home. Now, it's not always that love disappears in one great vanishing act. Because sometimes love's still there in fragments and, the way that they take their coffee, the way that you notice when they're tired, the way an old song can return you both for a second to who you used to be, in the way you still laugh about something from years ago and feel one small moment that the old couple you were before the kids, before the mortgage, before the business, before the repeated disappointments, that couple, they're still there. You're just not able to reach them so freely. And honestly, that can be the most confusing part. Because if there were no love left at all, if the feeling was clean and cold and obvious, maybe it'd be easier to understand. But many people live for years in a more complicated place where they still love parts of the person. They still respect parts of the life and they feel loyalty to their history. They still feel protective of their family that they built. But they're also exhausted from the emotional labor of hoping, asking, explaining, forgiving, adjusting, swallowing, restarting, and pretending that they no longer know whether they're staying because there's something alive between them or because they have become so frightened of what would happen if they stopped holding the structure up. And I think that is why so many people don't leave when they first feel lonely, and why so many people don't let themselves think the word leave. Because the word feels too dramatic for the quietness of what they're experiencing, or too final for a relationship that still has ordinary tenderness in it, or too selfish when the children are asleep down the hall, too disruptive when the house is still running and the bills are being paid and the family photos still look beautiful enough to convince everyone, including themselves, that perhaps this is simply what life becomes after a while. And so they wait. They wait for that feeling to pass. You get. They wait for the next holiday, for the baby to start sleeping through, for the business to settle, for the renovation to finish, for school to start, for school to end, for Christmas to be over, for the next birthday to be done with, for the next stressful work period to ease, for the next conversation, for the next promise, for the next apology, and for the next moment where the other person seems almost briefly like they might understand. And for a while, that waiting can feel like hope, because hope is very persuasive when it arrives, dressed as patience. And you tell yourself that all relationships have difficult chapters, and long term love is not always romantic or easy, that people go through seasons, and maybe you're expecting too much. Maybe you're too tired to see clearly, or maybe if you were less resentful, or less sensitive, or less depleted, or less demanding, the relationship would feel different. And so instead of asking whether something is fundamentally wrong, you turn the question inward and you start wondering where the problem is actually you. And can I tell you this, that inward turn, it can be devastating, because instead of saying, I feel lonely, you begin to say, maybe I'm hard to love. And instead of saying, I need more partnership, you begin to say, maybe I am too controlling. And instead of saying, I feel unseen, you begin to think, maybe I should be more grateful. And before long, the original need becomes buried under a layer of self doubt so thick that you can't tell whether you're unhappy because the relationship is failing you, or because you failed at being the kind of person who can be happy inside it. And I've heard versions of this again and again, not always in the same words, but yeah, in the same tone. And for me, it's the tone of someone who's almost asking permission to admit that the life they work so hard to build doesn't feel the way they thought it would. And they'll say things to me like, nothing's really wrong, or I know this probably sounds silly, or other people have it much worse. He's not a bad person. She's a good mom, or we have a beautiful house. The children are okay. I should be happy. I've said those things too. I felt them. I believed them. But what I often hear underneath all of that, it's not entitlement, it's not selfishness, it's just a person trying to reconcile the visible blessings of their life with the private ache of not feeling alive inside it anymore. And that is one of the loneliest forms of grief, because it's really hard to mourn a relationship while you're still standing inside it. It's really difficult to grieve a person who is still sitting across from you at dinner. And it's very hard to explain that you miss someone so much who technically is still there. And I think it's hard to say, hey, my marriage feels absent when your husband or wife is just in the next room. It's difficult to name the loss when there's been no funeral, no announcement, no clean ending. There's just been this really slow disappearance of warmth from the everyday where love used to be. And then there's the shame of admitting that the thing that you once wanted, the life you once prayed for, or worked for, or chose with such certainty, now feels heavy in your hands. The shame of wondering whether you changed too much or not enough, or whether you became someone that you don't recognize under the pressure of holding everything else together. The shame of having posted the holiday, or hosted the birthday, or smiled in the photo, accepted too many congratulations, or said too many times, yeah, we're good. And then later sat alone with the knowledge that the public version and the private version have drifted so far apart, it almost feels dishonest to keep appearing normal. But families are built on appearing normal. That's part of the problem. We're very good at performance. We know how to arrive at the barbecue together, how to put the children in cute matching outfits, how to talk about renovations, school choices, holidays, how to keep saying, yeah, we're busy but good, and how to stand beside each other in a photo and look like a life, even when the car ride there was silent and the car ride home will be worse. We know how to become believable. And sometimes we become so good at performing the family that we stop asking whether the people inside of it actually feel held. And I think this is one of the main reasons I wanted to create this podcast, because I wanted to place the conversations underneath that fancy performance, the conversations that usually only happen in whispers between close friends or in the car after a meeting, in your private notes app, or in a lawyer's office when someone finally has permission to say the thing that they've been carrying for years. I wanted a place to say that the end of a relationship is not always the sudden failure of love, and that sometimes it's just the final stage of a long, quiet, unacknowledged loneliness. And I wanted a place for us to talk about how the emotional load can turn a person into a version of themselves they don't like, and how resentment can make the voice hard, how exhaustion can make intimacy feel impossible, and how a person can be loved and still feel unseen, and how I'm fine can become a wall, and how the body knows a relationship is breaking before the mind is ready to admit it. And I wanted a place where we could be honest about the fact that some people are not ready to leave. Some people don't want to leave. Some people are terrified of leaving. Some people would prefer for the relationship to change rather than for it to end. And some people just want the language for what's been happening inside them so they can stop feeling angry or ungrateful or alone. So I don't think that this podcast or this episode is about deciding whether to stay or go. It's not as simple as that. Let me tell you, what I think this episode is actually about is recognizing the quiet places where the fracture begins. Maybe it's about sitting with the truth that a family can look whole and can still be under strain, and that a relationship can continue but be starving, and that a person can be surrounded by people and still feel profoundly alone. And let me tell you this, the most dangerous silence is not the one after a fight. It's the one that comes after someone stopped believing the fight will change anything. And maybe if we can tell the truth a little earlier, I'm not saying loudly or publicly, and not in a way that burns the whole house down, but just honestly to ourselves, then we might stop waiting until the break is the only language we have left. And if you're listening to this and you're feeling that place in your own body, I want to say this gently. Recognizing the fracture doesn't mean that you need to know what to do with it today. It doesn't mean you've got to make any sort of decision at all, let alone at the end of this episode. And it doesn't mean your relationship is over. It doesn't mean you failed. What it does mean is that something inside of you is trying to escape and tell you the truth. And sometimes the first honest act, it's not leaving, it's not staying, it's not repairing, it's not confronting or forgiving. Sometimes the first honest act is just admitting, even only to yourself, that something here has been breaking for a while, and pretending not to hear it hasn't made it disappear. So, in this episode, I want to now move from the quiet breaking into what happens inside a person when they start to realize that the life they're maintaining may no longer be the life that's holding them. I want us to talk about the guilt and the fear and the shame and the self doubt and the loyalty to the family you built and the strange grief of missing someone who's still in the house. I want us to talk about that moment when people begin asking themselves the question they are so terrified of. Is this just a difficult season, or is it something in me leaving? Because that is the question so many people carry quietly before anyone else knows. And so this is where I really want to pick our conversation back up, because I don't think this is part of a relationship that ever arrives, neatly. It arrives at some kind of honesty that usually comes after a really long period of silence. And when you finally allow yourself to understand that you've been trying to get attention from someone you love for a very long time, but they've been too busy or too frightened or too hopeful or too guilty or too responsible to do anything about it. So if you're listening and you're in this place, the first thing I want to offer you is not a reason to leave or a reason to stay. Because no one outside the emotional, legal, financial, and safety realities of your life can hand you that answer. Really, what I want to give you is an invitation to begin telling yourself the truth with more precision. Because just saying I'm unhappy, yeah, it's real, but it's also too broad to show you what your needs really are. Whereas by saying I feel lonely when we only talk about logistics, or I feel resentful because I'm carrying the remembering, or I feel frightened because every difficult conversation becomes a punishment. And those sorts of statements begin to give shape to the ache. So, what I want to give you as part of this episode are tools to fix things, because I'm certainly not someone who wants to break relationships or who doesn't believe in love and rebuilding, because I do, and I've been there and I've done that. So, one of the first tools, although I don't even like calling it a tool because it sounds too clinical for something so human, but it's simply the practice of naming the actual thing instead of living under the fog of a general sadness. And sometimes that means sitting in the car before you walk into the house and asking yourself, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady one, what am I actually feeling right now? And where did I first feel it today? Because often your body knows well before your mind does. And it may be telling you that you felt the tightening in your chest when your partner walked through the door and didn't look up from his phone, or when you sent a message and saw the tone of the reply, or when you realized that you had once asked again after planning the entire weekend around everyone else's needs, and then realized that no one had asked you what you wanted. And that naming matters because the unnamed pain often ends up becoming behavior. And when pain becomes behavior, it turns into snapping over nothing or withdrawing without explanation, scrolling in bed, refusing touch, making sarcastic comments, spending too much, working too late, drinking more than usual, becoming cold in the kitchen, or answering over and over again fine in a voice that is begging to be noticed, and resenting the other person for not noticing. And by the time that pain has been translated into this behavior, the conversation becomes about the behavior rather than the true wound underneath it. So, if there is hope for a couple in this place, and I believe that there is, that hope usually begins where at least one person becomes brave enough to translate the behavior back into the wound before the wound has turned entirely into contempt. Because contempt is where the air becomes very thin. And once you no longer just feel hurt by someone, but you begin to look down on them, once you no longer say, I need you, but instead start thinking, you're useless, you are weak, and you are selfish, or you're impossible, you're the problem, the relationship begins to lose the emotional conditions required for repair. Now, that doesn't mean anger is wrong, because anger can be intelligent and protective and necessary. And so, yeah, sometimes anger is the part of you that finally stands up after years of swallowing. But there's a real difference between anger that says this cannot continue and contempt that says you are beneath me. Because if a couple wants to repair, they have to learn to catch the moment where the criticism is longing in armor, and where the sharpness is loneliness, with a weapon in its hand, and where the accusation is really the last exhausted version of a request that has been made too many times. So, instead of saying, you never help me, which may be the sentence that comes out most easily when you're standing beside a sink of dishes and a lunchbox that still has yesterday's apple core inside of it, the more truthful sentence might be, I'm starting to feel like the whole family lives inside my head. And when you wait for me to tell you what to do, I feel less like your partner and more like the manager of a life that I thought we both created. And maybe instead of saying, you only care about work, the more truthful sentence might be, when you come home and your body's here but your mind is somewhere else, I feel like I'm getting the leftover version of you. And I miss feeling like there was a part of you that wanted to come home to me, not just to the house. And instead of saying, I'm fine, the more truthful sentence might be, hey, I'm not fine, but I'm scared that if I tell you the truth, you will defend yourself so quickly that I'll end up comforting you for the fact that I'm hurt. And those sentences are harder because you feel naked. And that's why we avoid them. It's much safer to be angry than to be seen needing something. But if repair is going to happen, someone has to create a doorway where the real truth can enter the room without immediately being dressed as like a prosecution. Now, a second tool. I want to talk about the power of pause. And this is something I talk about a lot. You've probably heard about my 4 pillars of communication from my book and from podcasts and from interviews. But in this context, the pause isn't some neat communication trick, and it's not a way to become perfectly calm before you speak. Let's be honest, most of us are not perfectly calm when we're hurt. But the pause is the small space where you do ask, am I about to speak from the part of me that wants to be understood, or from the part of me that wants to make them feel as bad as I feel? And something I do and I've had to learn from. And that question can change the direction of a conversation because so many arguments in relationships are not really attempts to solve anything. They're attempts to distribute pain, where one person feels so unseen and so they speak in a way that makes the other person feel attacked. And then the other person feels attacked and responds in a way that makes the first person feel even more unseen. And before long, the argument has become a room with no doors, full of old wounds, old proof, old examples, old Christmases, old birthdays, old text messages, old disappointments. And no one can remember how they got there, except that it started with something really small. So the pause doesn't mean you say nothing forever, and it definitely doesn't mean you swallow your needs to keep the peace. It means you slow the moment down enough to choose the sentence that gives the relationship the best chance of hearing the truth. And sometimes that sentence is simply, I want to talk about this, but I can feel myself getting sharp, and I don't want to say it in a way that makes you only hear my anger. And that kind of sentence can feel strange at first because it requires a kind of emotional leadership that, yeah, most of us were never taught. But it also creates a different atmosphere because rather than walking into the room with a weapon, you're walking in with a warning light and you're saying, hey, there's something here that really matters. And I don't want us to destroy it in the way we speak to each other about it. And if you want to repair a relationship, you have to learn to hear pain without immediately making it some kind of referendum on your entire character. Because if every expression of hurt becomes a trial in which you feel like you need to start defending your goodness, there'll be no room left for curiosity. And can I tell you, curiosity is one of the most underrated forms of love in a relationship that's gone quiet. Curiosity sounds like, when did you start feeling this way? And actually staying quiet long enough to hear the answer, even if the answer makes you feel uncomfortable. Curiosity sounds like, what have I not been seeing? Rather than give me examples so I can explain them away. So if there is hope, it begins in the willingness to look up together. And that doesn't mean the relationship will automatically survive because some relationships, they have been unattended for too long. And some have become unsafe. And some people only become interested in repair when there's a real consequence in front of them. But if both people can look up and say, hey, there is something here that we haven't cared for properly, then there may be something we can work with. And so that brings me to our third tool, and that is to stop trying to solve years of loneliness with one emotional conversation. Because one of the most painful things I see is the sudden urgency that arrives when one person finally says they can't keep going, and the other person panics and wants to fix everything immediately. And not necessarily because they're manipulative or insincere, but because they've only just realized that the relationship they assumed would continue has been quietly preparing to leave without them. And that panic can produce a kind of effort that, yeah, can feel intoxicating at first. Because suddenly, after years, there are flowers, long messages, offers of counseling, more school pickups, more compliments, more presents, more attention. And for the person who's been starving for those things, yeah, it feels like rain after a long drought. But it can also be heartbreaking Because part of them is thinking, why did I have to get this close to leaving before you decided I was worth noticing? And I think this is where couples have to understand the difference between crisis effort and sustained change. Because crisis effort is often fueled by fear. And fear can be intense and persuasive and even beautiful for a short period of time. But sustained change is fueled by responsibility. And responsibility is much quieter and much less theatrical and much more revealing. Fear says, I don't want to lose you. But responsibility says, I don't want to keep living in a way that makes you feel alone. Fear says, tell me what to do and I'll do it. But responsibility says, I'm going to learn. I'm going to learn about the architecture of our life because it belongs to me too. And fear says, look, I am trying. But responsibility, that says, I understand that you may not trust this yet, but I'm willing to keep showing up without demanding immediate applause. Fear makes promises in the emotional aftermath of a crisis a big fight, but responsibility is what remains on the ordinary Thursday 3 months later, when the house is busy and no one's clapping, and the person still does the thing because it's theirs to do. So, if you are in a relationship where someone is suddenly trying, I want to tell you to dismiss that effort because effort can be real and people do wake up. But I would tell you to watch it shape over time. Because the truth of change is not in the first week when everyone's worried. It's in the fourth week, the 10th week, the ordinary week, the week when there's been no dramatic conversation, no one has threatened to leave, but that new behavior has remained. And I'd say that if you're the person who's trying to change, you can't demand that years of disappointment vanish because you've now understood something. Because the person that you love may hear your apology but still have a body that braces. And yeah, they might see your effort, but they still might not trust it. They may want to believe you, but they might still feel tired. And that does not mean that your effort is pointless. It means that trust is not rebuilt enough, but it will come. You see repeated evidence, it's small, it's unglamorous, it's noticing, the groceries are low and not having to be asked to go and get them. Or it's booking the appointment because you know it's due. It's saying, I was defensive earlier because I felt ashamed, but I've thought about what you said and I do want to understand it better. And if you're the person receiving the effort and you've chosen even tentatively to see whether repair is possible, then part of the work may be allowing new evidence to register, not because you owe someone instant forgiveness and not because you need to ignore the years before of what had been happening. But because if you decide to try while also refusing to let anything count, you're both just going to end up living in some sort of courtroom. And that's not intimacy, that's punishment. And I'm saying this to you with a lot of compassion. I've been there. But sometimes the injured person doesn't want to punish. They just don't know how to stop protecting themselves. And their only protection, it ends up coming out as suspicion or as coldness or as sarcasm, little too late. Well, you only care now because you know I'm going to leave. And perhaps some of that is true. But if the relationship is going to have any chance, there has to be a way to hold both truths at once. Yeah, it took too long. And yes, something may now be changing. And yes, you'll hurt. But you're willing to observe where the behavior becomes trustworthy and you're not wanting to pretend the past didn't happen, but you do want to use the past to make a future genuinely trustworthy and happy and workable because you're trying to build something new. And I think the last tool I want to leave you with is a practice that I would encourage. And it's what I call making the invisible visible. And by that, I mean sitting down, and it might be over a coffee on a Saturday when no one's angry, and just writing down the real load of the family, not the obvious tasks like cooking and cleaning, but everything. The remembering, the anticipating, the planning, the social maintenance, the emotional monitoring, the health admin, the family obligations. the mental tabs that are always open. And this is not meant to be an exercise in proving who suffers more, although that can be tempting, but it's meant to let both people see the system they're living inside. Because sometimes a relationship isn't breaking because two people don't love each other. It's breaking because the system they're living in has become so unequal, so unspoken, and so dependent on one person's invisible labor that intimacy has no oxygen left. And when you make the invisible visible, the question shifts from why are you always angry to what have you been carrying? Or why didn't you ask? So why did the system require you to ask in the first place? And that language really matters because ownership is very different to a system. Now, another thing you can do to protect the invisible is just to have something like a weekly conversation, not about logistics. I think because by the time so many couples realize that they're actually in trouble, their entire relationship has been reduced to some sort of administrative contact, right? The kind of conversations that you have with a housemate or a project manager, where the topics are just bills and timetables and children and groceries and family obligations. And let me tell you this, a relationship cannot live on logistics alone. Yeah, it might survive there for a bit, but realistically, it's like a plant, and the plant can't survive in poor light longer than you expect. It's not going to thrive. So once a week, make time for a conversation where the purpose is not to run the household, but to find out what's happening inside the other person. And don't make it grand or dramatic, because grand and dramatic often becomes unsustainable. Just make it ordinary enough to repeat it. Ask each other, what felt heavy this week? And really listen. Don't seek to correct. Ask, where did you feel supported or where do you need more support? Because repair is about naming. It's about noticing what worked and what needs more repair. Ask, where did you feel alone this week? But don't punish the answer. And I get it, this can feel really awkward. I almost hope it does. Because awkward often means you are doing something unfamiliar rather than repeating the old pattern. And if you have spent years communicating through logistics and sarcasm and silence and defensiveness, then tenderness can really feel unnatural, even embarrassing. So let it be awkward. Do it anyway. Don't make the awkwardness proof that it's pointless. Many good things begin awkwardly. And one other sign to watch closely is whether there is still repair after conflict. Because a relationship doesn't require the absence of conflict to be healthy. But it does require some way of returning to each other after the conflict has passed. And I think many couples are less damaged by the argument itself than by the loneliness after it. The way one person shuts down, the way one person pretends nothing happened, or the way no one comes back to say, I'm sorry, I think I missed what you were trying to tell me. Well, that got bigger than it needed to because we were both tired. Or something as simple as, I don't want us to keep doing that. Repair doesn't always need to be a long conversation. Sometimes long conversations are part of the problem. They're exhausting. And then people start, feeling more hurt. They leave feeling more bruised than before. Sometimes repair is just a small, sincere return, a hand on the shoulder, or a text from the next room saying, I hate how that went. Can we try again later? Or a moment in the kitchen when someone says, I went straight to defending myself, and I can see that that made you feel more alone. The point is not perfection. The point is return. Because when there is no return, each conflict becomes another brick in the wall. And sometimes the most loving thing a couple can do is stop treating the relationship as the only problem and begin looking at the life they've built around it. Because some relationships are not failing because the love is gone, but because the life around the love has become impossible. There's too much pressure. There's too much labor. There's too much noise. There's too much performance. There is too much administration. And if that's the case, hope may look less like a date night and more like a genuine restructuring of a family system. It might mean one person needs to change their work boundaries. It might mean that domestic labor needs to be redistributed in a way that doesn't require constant reminders. And it may mean outsourcing something if there's capacity to do so. It probably means reducing commitments, saying no to extended family obligations that are draining your relationship. And it may mean protected time alone, protected time together, protected rest, protected conversations. It may mean that both people accept a relationship can't survive indefinitely as the last item on a list that never ends. And this is where I really want to offer hope, but the kind of hope that's realistic. I don't believe in telling people that every relationship can be saved if they communicate properly, because that's not true. And that can often be more harmful. But I do believe that some relationships are more alive than they feel in their worst season. And I do believe that some couples are not loveless so much as lost, not broken beyond repair so much as trapped inside patterns that have made tenderness difficult to reach. I believe that some people can wake up, and I believe that some people can learn to notice. I believe that resentment can soften when it is finally understood and when behavior changes in ways that are consistent enough for the body to trust. I believe that a person who has been carrying too much can begin to put things down if the other person truly learns to pick them up, not as a favor, not as a performance, but as ownership. And I believe that couples can build a second relationship with each other, not the innocent one, not the early one, not the one before children or disappointment or exhaustion, but a more honest one, a more adult one. A relationship that has looked at the cost of silence and decided not to keep paying it. And I also believe that sometimes hope is not that the relationship survives, but that the truth arrives before the ending becomes cruel. So if you're listening to this and you feel in the ache of it, if you can see yourself in the kitchen or in the car, in the bed, in the I'm fine, in the resentment you don't like in yourself, in the loneliness you've not known how to name, I want you to begin gently. Not abandoning your life in a moment of panic or making some big decision simply because the feeling has become unbearable tonight, but by telling the truth with more care and more courage than silence has allowed. Write it down before you say it. Say it to yourself before you say it to them. Ask, what am I really trying to say? What do I want them to understand beneath the anger? What would repair need to look like in behavior and not just words? And remember, the opposite of love is not always anger. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it is the calm that comes after too many unheard conversations. Sometimes it's the quiet relief of no longer expecting anything. So let this episode be an invitation to listen earlier to yourself, to your body, to your resentment, to your loneliness, to the person beside you if they are still trying to reach you, to the small ordinary moments where the relationship is telling the truth long before anyone says the word separation. Because most relationships don't break the day someone leaves. They break in the silence long before anyone packs a bag. But sometimes, if the silence is named early enough, if the truth is met with humility rather than defense, and if the invisible is made visible, and if repair becomes a practice rather than a performance, and if both people are willing to build something more honest than the life they've been performing, the break doesn't have to be the ending. Sometimes it can be the moment the pretending stops. Sometimes it can be the moment two people finally stop managing a life and begin telling the truth about it. Sometimes it can be the beginning of a different kind of love, one that's less polished from the outside, but more alive on the inside. And if that's possible for you, I hope you are so brave enough to reach for it. And if it's not possible, I hope you're brave enough to stop mistaking silence for peace. Because you deserve a life where you don't have to disappear to keep everything standing.